Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and a very good afternoon to all the people inside this room today. My name is Muhammad Asyraf bin Zulkipli. I am from U64, and today I will be talking about satellite communications. Now, without even realizing it, our lives have been heavily dependent on satellite technology every single day. They play a major role in society nowadays. It is through satellites that we have access to GPS, which are collectively known as the Global Positioning System, which allows us to travel the world without being lost. It is through satellites that we can predict the weather, but most importantly, it is through satellites that we get access to things such as television, radio, the internet, and so on. Without further distractions, let us begin with the fundamental question of the afternoon today. Hello. I did. Oh. Alhamdulillah. Okay. Now, as I was saying earlier, let us begin with the fundamental question of the afternoon. What is a satellite? Now, a satellite is a celestial body orbiting the Earth or another planet. A common misconception regarding satellites is that people often thought of satellites as being artificial. Well, it is wrong. There are actually two types of satellites, known as natural satellites and artificial satellites. Imagine the sun, right? The Earth is orbiting the sun 360 degrees for over 24 hours. And we could, in this situation, we could say that the Earth is a satellite because it orbits the sun. Now, that is a natural satellite. An artificial satellite is a man-made object or an artificial body which is placed in orbit around the Earth or another planet in order to collect information. What you see in front of you is an example of artificial satellites because they orbit the Earth. So that is the basic principles behind the satellite. Now, you know the basic view of what satellites are. Now, let's envision ourselves in a world without satellite technology. What would happen exactly? What goes through your mind if satellites don't exist in this world? Well, according to scientists, the following scenarios will likely to occur. First, there will be a compromise of communications. This is also known as the dramatic reduction in our ability to communicate and share information. Because we live now in a very digitalized world, if we lose access to that, we'll become more like cavemen, I guess. We just roam the world like, ooh, ah, ah. I guess. Well, from this thought bubble perspective, this itself would cause hundreds and millions of internet connections to vanish. Imagine, all our internet connections just suddenly disappeared. No more ROS, no more ML, no more Instagram. How are we going to live? Oh my gosh. Now, aside from these, other problems also occur, such as we would lose our access to GPS. Well, in a country such as Brunei, we rarely use GPS systems because it is a very small country, right? But in the USA, the citizens of United States of America are heavily dependent on GPS, Global Positioning System. So if they were to lose access to this valuable resource, they would lose access to their most precious travel companion, which is the GPS. And in alternative, they would use maps instead. Again, cavemen. Now, let's go through the brief history of the satellite. It was the Soviet Union in 1957 that created the very first artificial satellite known as Sputnik 1. That is the image of Sputnik 1. Fun fact, any images of satellites that you see on the internet are actually fake. they are actually heavily edited so that it looks real. Yeah, so that is why so many people have thought of this world as flat, because they believe satellites don't exist. Well, scientists call those people flat-headers, because they don't have any brains. Now, after the release of Sputnik 1, it was followed by the release of Sputnik 2 later that year. Surprisingly, the first living passenger aboard on an orbit was a dog called Laika. There he is, such a cutie, isn't it? Oh my God. So, the aftermath of the Soviet Union or the Russians, kind of like releasing these two satellites, kickstarted the space race, in which multinational corporations and organizations are racing it out to achieve global domination by, oh my gosh, sorry, by releasing their own artificial satellites into space. America wanted on this space race themselves, so in 1958 they launched Explorer 1. Explorer 1 was actually released on the 31st of January 1958. So, to put that into perspective, yesterday was the 60th anniversary of America's very first artificial satellite launch. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. As of today, there have been tens of thousands of artificial satellites launched. Satellites vary in shape and size as well. One satellite is as big as a football field, the International Space Station, which is owned by the Americans, while some satellites such as CubeSats could be smaller than your laptop, and they could be the size of your palm, as shown in the pictures. Now, as we have proceeded thus far in this talk today, we know that there are multiple applications or types of satellites that are used for different purposes. My goal of today's talk is to talk about communications satellite, because I believe they are the most crucial in our atmosphere and society today. Now, what are communication satellites exactly? A communication satellite is a type of artificial satellite for the purpose of sending and receiving communication data between a source and destination. It may sound a bit confusing now, but you'll see how simple it is later on. Communication satellites are used to provide data communication and relaying services for televisions, radio, telecommunications, weather, and internet services. Now, here comes the bulk of my presentation today, which are how do communication satellites work? Now, as I said earlier, communication satellites are used for telecommunication services, internet providers, radio signals, and television signals. The most important feature of a communications satellite is the transponder. It's just a fancy word for a radio that receives a conversation at one frequency, and then it amplifies it and retransmits it back to Earth on another frequency. Again, it may sound confusing at first, but you'll see later on. Now, on the first image, which is the white, it showcases how a basic satellite transmission system works, in which first there is the uplink, where data is beamed up to the satellite from a ground station on Earth. Now, the ground station on Earth can be in the form of satellite dishes, in which they receive and they also transmit the signals themselves. Next, the satellite processes the data using a number of onboard transponders. Transponders in this view can be such as radio receivers, amplifiers, and transmitters. These transponders boost the incoming signals and change their frequency. So when the satellite above the space performs the downlink to the Earth, it will send the data to several locations on Earth, thus providing a huge radius of data. Finally, there is also the downlink, where data is sent back down to another ground station elsewhere on Earth. Now, how do we classify satellites based on their heights above Earth's surface? Well, there are two categories to this. This basically refers to the position of the satellite themselves above the atmosphere of the Earth. So their position determines what type of data they transmit as well. So the first position is the low Earth orbits. in which they occupy a region of space from 180 kilometers to 2,000 kilometers above Earth. Whereas geosynchronous orbits, they operate at an altitude greater than 36,000, which is more than 36,000 kilometers. As you can see here, the white kind of circle ring shows the radius of the low Earth orbit, and orbits, satellites that are placed in this system, satellites that are placed on this system use different types of electromagnetic radiation. As you can see here, the different types of electromagnetic radiation, but satellites mainly use two types, which are radio and microwaves, because they have the longest wavelength. Wavelength is defined as the highest points between these two peaks, and that is called one wavelength. Now, radio waves are usually for low Earth orbit satellites because they are reflected from the charged layer of the upper atmosphere. Whereas microwaves, they can pass through the atmosphere, therefore they can reach higher distances, and thus they can reach geosynchronous satellites. Now, how are satellites held up in space? In 1728, Isaac Newton thought of an experiment called the cannonball thought experiment. He imagined a cannon on top of a mountain. Without gravity, the cannonball should move in a straight line. Makes sense, right? But if gravity is present, then its path will depend on its velocity. If they travel at a fast enough velocity, then the gravitational pull of the Earth won't be as strong, and thus this could be called as the gravitational force equals the centripetal force of the satellites. Now, I've picked a quote from Arthur C. Clarke, which is one of the redeeming pioneers in satellite technology. The only way of finding the limits of the possible is by going beyond them into the impossible. Satellite technology has changed so many lives, and it has brought new technologies in its era of finance. So humans will continue to benefit from them in the near future. That is all from me. Thank you.
Okay, Asyraf. So I saw the slides earlier about the difference in geo and LEO, the heights of those satellites, right? I wasn't very clear about why is it specifically the LEO would be at a lower height compared to geo. I wasn't clear about that.
Well, according to the slide, low Earth orbit usually constitutes an altitude of 200 to 2,000 kilometers, whereas geosynchronous orbits, they constitute altitudes of higher than 35,000 kilometers. And so, lower Earth orbits usually use radio waves because radio waves have longer wavelengths than microwaves, and thus they won't be able to pass through the atmosphere.
Okay, but I still want to have clarification about what difference does that make in terms of the data that we receive? So, for example, I'm curious, like all these things like your GPS, all that. What would that use then? Would it be actually the lower satellite or the geo ones?
As I said earlier, the two types of electromagnetic radiation involved in communication satellites mainly are radio waves and microwaves. And so, radio waves, they constitute a longer wavelength than microwaves. And thus, when they are beamed up through the atmosphere, so imagine that this is the atmosphere. So this is the radio waves. When they are moving or when they are transmitting their signals, they are reflected off the atmosphere, and thus that is why satellites, which are usually constituted in lower Earth orbits, they usually have electromagnetic waves of radio waves, whereas microwaves, due to their kind of like shorter wavelength than the radio waves, they can pass through the atmosphere and thus they can reach more distant satellites, which are often located in the geosynchronous orbits.
Thank you, Asyraf, for the informative presentation. I have a question. Since the satellite is orbiting the Earth, how does this get its energy from?
Can you repeat the question?
How does this satellite get its energy from? By what means? I'm sure there's no wireless charging in there.
Yeah, but they do have solar panels, so they can use the power of the sun to kind of like power them up, even though they are in a constant orbital motion.
Second question is related to the first question is now by Chigoyani. Why do you need LFO if you have GEO?
Well, it all goes back to the functions of the electromagnetic radiation. You see, radio waves that are used to broadcast radio and television. Microwaves that are used for cooking, radar, telephones, and other signals. In this sense, microwaves are often used for internet services, and radio waves, they do a much better job at providing radio and television services. And so the distinction is kind of parallel. So that is why they both have their own orbits to place the satellites on.
Okay, maybe one last question. I know that internet is very world-changing idea that we changes the way we communicate. Some people they just WhatsApp instead of talking, even though we're just like 1 minute apart. But the question is, how do you tackle cybercrime, all those internet threats, computer problems?
Yeah, this is one of the problems that I come across when I research. It all depends on the country's own laws and regulations. Because these kind of things are very, what do you call this? They can't be ignored. And so kind of like Brunei, they have Bruchert, right? Which is the Brunei computer. Yeah. So it all depends on how a country regulates and controls the flow of the system. They can kind of like train kids to use their electronic devices more properly, and kind of like train them to avoid cyber criminal acts.
Thank you for your talk. I think that was very, very interesting. So your main focus was, it's on satellite technology, and you purposely chose communication because, of course, our whole world revolves around it, right? So I guess a simpler question. What other satellite technologies are there other than communication?
Well, other types of satellites include reconnaissance satellites, in which they involve military purposes, and thus they won't be revealed to the public eye because they generally work under very secretive acts. Aside from reconnaissance satellites, we have also weather satellites, which can forecast weather and predict weather in the future. We also have I think that's all.
Thank you for that question. It just got me thinking of another question. so many types of satellites, hundreds probably, I don't know even know how many satellites there are out there. How is it that they don't collide with each other?
They actually do collide with each other. Scientists have termed the excess kind of like equipment or excess items as space junk. Basically, they just float in space, kind of like unleft. And so scientists are continually trying to find ways to prevent this from happening, such as they implement rocket thrusters in communicates to prevent from collision, and they implement smaller, more effective solar panels so that they won't collide with the other space junk debris.